Good afternoon and welcome to Raisina Live Studios. And we're here this afternoon now talking about sort of interesting question of is there such a thing, are there European values? And the European Union has traditionally been known, and in many parts of the world continues to be known, as a values superpower as much as it is an economic trading power. But the question that we will be asking today is how can it continue to hold on to these values, some of its founding values, at a time when there are increasing pressures domestically and abroad on not just the EU but on many other similar large countries. And I have today with me Minister Edgar Rinkēvičs and Heather Grabbe from the Open Society Institute. And Minister, I'm going to start with you if I might. Are there such a thing as European values? Was Europe founded around values, or is it purely an economic coalition?
Well, actually it started as purely economic coalition and it expanded over the time as political union, and what we are now referring very often that we are also a union of values. I wouldn't say that there are very specific European values. I would say actually that we are basing our values on universal values: human rights, rule of law, democracy. And as you rightly pointed out, that also internally at the EU level we have debate about those issues, about the need to have very coherent strategy and also policy and values both internally and externally. The good thing is that EU is probably, and its member states as part of EU, the only superpower, as you said, that always constantly is raising issues of human rights, of values, also in all international fora as well as in all bilateral discussions with countries around the globe.
Thank you, Minister. Heather, in some sense, is having a consistent position on values, on your own values, important in foreign policy? Does it help? And does sort of a lack of cohesiveness hurt?
It definitely helps, and it's very important to maintain a sense of what values lie behind policies, because it's the foundation of the policies. It's what gives them substance, and it also is the operating assumption on which politicians can work when they're in other parts of the world. The difficult part is that the EU is not one country. And so you have to represent, if you are, for example, an EU diplomat elsewhere in the world, the views of 27 countries which have internal debates among themselves. And that can sometimes be tricky. But it's important because it still matters to citizens. We've done recent research showing that 93% of European citizens in at least 6 of the member states strongly support fundamental values, justice, democracy, rule of law, but also freedom of expression, for example, and media freedom. These things are still held dear. What has changed is not the views of Europeans on these issues, it's the views of politicians and how much they feel that they have support in the prevailing zeitgeist, the prevailing debate, to express those values not only domestically but also abroad.
If I might ask a follow-up question to that. If 93% of the people that you surveyed in these 6 countries do approve these values, do they, in your opinion, you may not have asked this question, do they associate these values with the Union at all?
We didn't ask that question, but there's other research showing that they do see that. I mean, it's there in Article 2 of the Treaty of on European Union, which sets out the values. But what's very tricky is that the EU has no secondary law to back it up. So on things like competition policy or trade policy, the EU has very detailed legislation which sets out clearly what the terms of the debate are about. Whereas on values, it's not really there. How do you measure media freedom, for example? How do you measure the independence of the judiciary in a member state? That's something that there isn't an EU standard. The EU has to draw on the Council of Europe and on the United Nations and other such guidelines. And that's why it's very hard to say, okay, let's pin down what is the EU standard on this issue.
I'll come back to that idea because I think there's something interesting there. Minister, Europe faces a lot of choices in its foreign policy going forward, as do its member states. Many member states would be increasingly interested in, for example, investment from the People's Republic of China. Other member states and leaders of member states would probably want a more comfortable relationship with the Russian Federation. And all of these you could make arguments for and against on a realist basis. But what I want to ask is, how is it that you feel European politicians, both at the at the level of the Union and in member states, should try and balance these things going forward? That the realist demands of their foreign policy and the traditional values that are holding Europe together.
Well, to some extent, it's a permanent debate how you balance realpolitik with values. And indeed, you are absolutely right. When we come together, I would correct you a little bit. At this point, as 28, but soon to be 27 EU member states, then we have those strategic orientations and discussions how we can, for instance, approach relations with People's Republic of China. Because there is a huge interest, of course, to develop trade. But then we also know that there are issues that we are raising constantly, both at, for instance, United Nations, in bilateral contacts, and also in EU-China summits that are related with human rights issues, that are related with religious groups and their rights. And I could continue. The same happens with Russia. We all understand that Russia is playing an important role in the world and also in Europe. We were particularly upset about what happened in 2014, illegal annexation of Crimea, and also the kind of breach of international law that we haven't seen since the end of the World War II. At the same time, when we meet Russia, whatever format there is, we also raise the issues of human rights, the rights of journalists, and actually, of course, we are having sometimes very tense discussion. But I think that at the end of the day, when we come together as EU foreign ministers or leaders of our countries, we are able to find this common ground how to address both. Not always megaphone diplomacy works. Sometimes, actually, I would say that what you do in private meetings, addressing specific issues, is the way forward. But sometimes you have to have also a very clear message that also our publics hear.
Heather, I'll sort of take you up on that point about the strange difference to an outsider between how the EU talks about values and maybe politics more generally, and how it manages its economic conversation. One does know, for example, that the European Central Bank has certain powers of one kind or another over domestic central banks, which it has exerted or not exerted, in spite of the fact that sometimes there are disagreements between the domestic central banker and their own government. The ECB has a role to play in mediating that dispute. But there doesn't seem to be any way in which European institutions or other member states can talk to a particular member state, say about the judiciary or about the freedom of the press. Where do you see this going? Will it lead to some kind of rupture, or is there are there things in the works that we should be looking at that will create structures that manage to, or institutions that manage to moderate these differences?
Well, as Minister Rinkēvičs was pointing out earlier, the EU started as an economic community, and its primary powers remain in the economic domain. Competition policy, trade policy, those are clearly EU competences. And rule of law as regards the single market and the governance of economic relationships remains incredibly important at EU level, and there is very widespread consensus. There's no EU government, I think it's fair to say, that would contest the EU's competences and the need to defend rule of law, to keep the single market working, to maintain the level playing field, and to ensure that the EU's external trading partnerships work effectively. But the different member states have very different constitutional arrangements when it comes to all kinds of other issues. Governance of minority rights, for example, varies hugely, from compulsory multilingualism in Finland, for example, in any part of the country that has more than a 12% Swedish minority, for example. Whereas that's different from other member states which have different provisions. And representative democracy in all countries globally is under enormous pressure, because the limits of a system that was set up in the 19th century are being felt in the digital age, when citizens expect a very different kind of relationship with government. And that's something that the EU is not competent to deal with. It can look at issues like rule of law, also press freedom, independence of the judiciary, in terms of international standards and best practice. But it's quite hard to change things which really need to be negotiated at national level and decided there. But I think the key question is, are universal values on which European values are based are they still held dear by the population? And in most parts of the world, you see that they clearly are. Even in countries which are experiencing growing authoritarianism, people still want to see debate. They still want to be able to read a variety of views in the newspaper and online. They still actually want to have a lifestyle in which they are able to make a lot of choices. And so that fundamental desire of the human being to experience a degree of freedom remains there. And that's the key connection with the values. That's what makes them live beyond the precise constitutional arrangements.
Minister, do you think you're optimistic about the future of this particular conversation in Europe?
Yes, actually you are absolutely right that we had some lack of instruments. However, I would say that currently European Court of Justice is more and more ruling on issues that are related to rule of law, human rights. Second, we are developing now within European Union so-called peer review mechanism, which means that actually all EU member states come together, they will be provided, it's not yet enacted, but they will be provided report from the European Commission on how the Commission sees development of rule of law, development of a human rights situation, and then discuss those issues. And finally, well, if there are serious problems, then there is so-called Article 7, which has been actually let's
the nuclear
say already
option.
used twice, but we have also seen that there have been deficiencies, very serious deficiencies, why this so-called nuclear option doesn't work also right now. So actually we are learning by doing. It takes some time, it takes also some development, but I'm rather optimistic that the values issues will be high on the agenda.
And I would just add that, in fact, the European Court of Justice has been increasingly activist on this because they've seen the threat to the whole legal order of the EU if violations of rule of law are allowed to continue. So just yesterday, there were two really important rulings. One which was on ruling that the NGO law put forward by the Hungarian government is actually not in compliance with EU law. And the other one was about independence of the judiciary in Poland and the need for defense of the independence of the judiciary. So the fact that the court is there saying the legal order needs these values to be to underpin it is a critical new element.
There are some parts of India, for example, where when the Supreme Court rules on a certain issue, do their best to ignore it. And that is an issue that even in a federation like ours, which is fairly strongly central, has been a problem. And do you think that that might happen?
Well, compliance is key because in any legal order, you have to rely on most people to comply with the law most of the time. You can't police everything. And in the EU, it's the national governments who have to do that.
There have been occasions, I think.
There have been plenty of occasions where member states haven't complied with ECJ rulings, and then the Commission has to come back and ask for fines to be imposed. We haven't quite got there on the two cases I mentioned, but that may well be where it ends up. And I think the point made about the need for new mechanisms and to use peer review, to bring in the political element to support the legal procedures is absolutely vital, because you need to be able to show in a supranational system like the EU that there is broad, overwhelming majority support by the other governments for maintaining the rule of law.
I have and I think I'll end with this one. Maybe it should not just be a government-to-government conversation. I think that the question here maybe should be, if not just people to people, that politician to politician. Is there a sense in which you think that electorates and politicians in other countries, in particular member states, are being spoken to by leaders? And if a person in Europe country A respects a leader of Europe country B, is there some sense in which you see a common political sphere developing that can address these issues?
That's a great question. I think we need another 15 minutes to discuss it, but to have a short answer, look, there are very different currently political leaders and also different political cultures and also philosophies. But I believe that you have now developing the situation where there are people who are listening to, for instance, the French president and the Hungarian prime minister, and they have a bit different views on how to
and not just in France or in Hungary.
And not just in France or in Hungary.
Exactly. That's it.
Yes, and the fact that the many multiple languages of the European Union do add up towards a media sphere in which debates travel very quickly from one country to another. That affects things too. Digital media especially spread stories very fast, but they don't necessarily bring societies towards a consensus. And that is the real paradox of the digital age for democracy.
Well, that's the job of politicians. Thank you very much. Thank
you.
you both. I hope you enjoyed that.